there, sparkly beans. It's Avery here for another episode of Practical Astrology 101. If you're new here, my name is Avery and I help justice-aligned, neurodivergent, and nerdy humans to cultivate ease and self-trust for growing into our emerging future. And one of the ways I do that is with astrology. So we are getting very close to the end of our little mini fundamentals series within Practical Astrology 101. And today I'm actually recording this on the new moon in Virgo, so I thought it would be a perfect time to talk a little bit about some special topics related to the moon, including our lunar phases and some other little topics that don't have a more obvious home. So before I get started, I just want to note that if you are seeing this before this date, I want to let you know, if you haven't heard already, that I am really excited to be doing a collaborative live workshop with Alex Ritchie on the non-binary moon. That's going to be happening on September 10th, which is a Saturday, which is actually the upcoming full moon. And that will be taking place at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern time if you're in the States, and you can look up obviously the conversions for that. You will find a link below in the description if you're interested in learning about some of the ways that we can work with the moon that are more sort of non-binary, sort of queered, not just looking at the feminine associations of the moon, but maybe destabilizing that and playing with that a little bit. And if you do resonate with the moon as a feminine archetype, we're not throwing that out, we're just sort of expanding the way we think about the moon. So whether you're an astrologer, a witchy person, none of the above, just kind of curious, we would love for you to join us. There's a sliding scale, and you will get access not only to the live workshop, but to the recording. But you need to do that, sign up in advance at the link below. Okay, so that's a little moon thing that we're going to be doing. So let's go ahead and get into talking about the moon. So as we move through the month, over the course of the month, obviously the moon is going to cycle around the Earth, orbit around the Earth. And so it, in the astrological chart, is going to circle that zodiacal wheel. And so the moon is going to pass through each of the signs every single month. And that speed of the moon, that very fast orbit, gives it a kind of ability or can be useful, I think, in that it, unlike the planets that move a lot slower, you're always getting a chance for moon in whatever sign. And so the moon in its signs can be totally used if you're wanting to work more with a sign. You can look through when is the moon going to pass through that sign, because it's going to do that very frequently. So it can be really useful in that way. It's roughly a 27-day orbit, and so it goes about 13 degrees around the chart every day. So it's about 2.5-ish days per sign. One little concept that maybe doesn't necessarily fit into the flow of the video otherwise, so I'm just going to stick it in here, that you may or may not have heard of, something called a void of course moon. So if you've ever heard that term, I'll just briefly mention it. I don't work with it a lot, but the void of course moon is a time when, a lot of times in magical practice or other traditions, there's a recommendation that you kind of hold tight on a void of course moon, that it can be, if you have that in your natal chart, it can be just a somewhat weaker moon, or less able to bring about the lunar significations, because it's basically has made its last aspect of any kind, specifically of the ones we've talked about. So the square, the opposition, the conjunction, the trine, and the sextile. It's not going to be making any more of those aspects until it goes into the next sign. So depending on where all the other planets are, you can imagine sometimes the void, of course, is very short, because there's some planet that's at the very end of the sign, so it can just be a super short period of time, or it might be longer. So that's going to vary wildly just depending on where everything is. So as it makes this orbit around the signs, one thing to note is that as it gets towards the end of a sign, before it transitions into the next, once it's made its last aspect, that might be a period of time where, you know, doing lunar things using the moon in your practice may not be quite as strong. And if you have that in your natal chart, it's just a note to make about your moon, maybe a little challenge in its ability to bring about sort of lunar significations. And just as a reminder, since it's been a while since we covered planets, I'll make sure to include a link if you haven't already gone through this fundamental series, you know, check out the video on the planets. But the moon associations include things like our emotions, our subconscious, our ability to like care and nurture. They include our instinct, bodily instinct, like our responses. You know, if we're in a crisis situation or a traumatic situation, like how do we respond? Or just a day-to-day where we're kind of pinged a little bit emotionally, like how do we respond to that? It includes there are significations with kind of our roots and family. It's often associated with the mother, but again, you know, check out the non-binary moon workshop. You know, that's not like the only way you can think of it. And so sure, if you relate to that mothering archetype or you have a mother figure, a maternal figure in your life, but it doesn't have to be gendered. You can think of it more in the sense of kind of like roots and like how you're cared for from an early age. You can think about how you care for yourself and others now. And you can think about subconscious as well with the moon. And it has this kind of fluid nature, right? Because it is so fast moving and it is constantly changing in that way. Now, an interesting thing about the moon and its relationship with Saturn is that this is just like kind of a fascinating little pattern. I'm not sure if I mentioned it in the transits video, but so we said that the orbit around is 27 days. So that's how long it takes it to go around through all the signs. But then the what we call the synodic cycle, or more commonly just moon phases. Synodic cycle, synod comes from sun, right? So the synodic cycle is anything's, any planet's cycle from a conjunction. But you could really say actually, because you know, the planets vary, but it's the cycle of any planet's relationship with the sun. And for most of them, including the moon, that it's going to be this concept of, well, no, I shouldn't say, actually ignore the for most of them. They all move in different ways, and we're actually going to talk about that in a later, more like advanced video where we will talk about the synodic cycles. But for the moon in particular, because the moon moves so fast, faster than the sun, and the sun and the moon both have very regular orbits, right? They're the only what we call planets in the chart, but the luminaries are the only ones that have just regular motion, because of course the Earth is regularly orbiting the sun, which means that from our perspective, the sun's motion is regular, and then the moon is regularly orbiting the Earth. Everything else, we're looking at our perspective, our orbit relative to another orbit, and so it's going to be irregular. But the moon and the sun are just a regular orbit, and that's why we time things by the moon and the sun. They're predictable. So that synodic cycle with the moon is one new moon to the next. So it's one conjunction between sun and moon, that's the new moon, all the way around. We're going to talk about phases in a second, but all the way around through all the phases back to the new moon. That synodic cycle has the same length as the orbit of Saturn, except Saturn, it's in years, and the moon, it's in days. So that synodic cycle is approximately 29 and a half days, and Saturn's orbit is approximately 29 and a half years. And so there's this really interesting, relationship, this fascinating relationship that the Hellenistic astrologers definitely noted and was kind of a big deal, because if you think about it, the moon, from their point of view, before they had seen anything past Saturn, the moon is the closest, Saturn is the farthest. Moon is the fastest moving, like super quick and fast moving. Saturn, slow. And so there's this sense of like polarities of what's close and what's far, what's fast and what's slow, what's immediate. And so this comes into the significations of the Moon and Saturn. What's immediate and bodily and personal, Moon. And then Saturn is one of the two social planets, but it's also really had significations around the kind of like the heavens, the outer limits. You know, Saturn was the limit between what we can see and what we can't see. It's the last visible planet, and so there's this sense of Saturn almost as a portal or as a gatekeeper. Some of the Saturn significations around like limits and boundaries come from that, because it's the gatekeeper to what's beyond. In the Hellenistic view, there was this sense of the kind of the ether, the spirit, the universe, like what is divine and sort of on the like outer ring. You may have seen there these like diagrams that show this, the idea of this like outer ring and the heavenly nature of the fixed stars, which make up the constellations in the sky that were referenced for the zodiac. So like the zodiacal signs is like out here in this like heavenly sphere, and the planets are kind of serving as these intermediaries, bringing heaven down to earth, while Saturn is the furthest out, the closest to those kind of those heavens, those fixed stars. The Greeks called the planets the wandering stars, and so they were considered like a little less, you know, they're in between like earth and heaven. They're a little less divine. That's not language I would use, but that was sort of the idea, because they aren't as like regular and fixed from our point of view, because we can see how their orbits vary. They had this sense of being kind of in the middle, and Saturn was the furthest out, and then the Moon was closest in, and so the Moon relating to Earth and Saturn relating to heaven. So there's this really interesting interplay, and you can, you know, see how you have these big phases of your life in terms of like your Saturn returns, which don't happen that often, right? And so your Saturn return, kind of a big deal. I'm right now in my just like coming into my Saturn square, which is another kind of point of tension. And you might have your Saturn opposition, second Saturn square, and then back to another Saturn return when you're around the age of 60. So that's that big cycle, whereas the Moon, you're always getting this cycle, and it's always really immediate. And so if we think about the way that the Moon is experienced, right? You know, we talked about the significations of the Moon, but like they come from really obvious things, because the Moon is, of course, this very immediate body, right? It orbits us. It is, it has this kind of sense of, you know, you can see it from the time that you're a child, right? You might not be able to identify Venus in the sky or, you know, Mars in the sky, but you can say, Mom, that's the Moon from a pretty young age. You can experience the effect of the lunar phases right here tangibly on Earth. We of course know that the Moon affects the tides. It affects all the water on Earth, and we have water in our body. So there's this association, like we're made up mostly of water, there's this association between embodied experience, being on the Earth and the Moon. You know, agriculture, like plants, there's a relationship to the lunar phases in terms of like how much light there is at night. Of course, we live in a world where there's electric light on all the time, but you know, if you're in a very not very populated place, right, then the Moon is going to have a direct effect of how light it is at night, how bright it is at night, or how dark it is at night. And so it makes sense that there are significations that have to do with the amount of light in the sky. They're, you know, timing wise, I mentioned that because the Sun and the Moon are so regular, it makes sense they're used for timing. There's also, you know, if you are a person who menstruates or has menstruated, of course, menstrual cycles vary. As we know, not everybody has a regular menstrual cycle, but a lot of folks have a menstrual cycle that syncs up pretty close to that synodic cycle. And so some people can track where they are in their cycle based on the moon phases. And so that's something you can imagine, that before we had computers and can look up everything about astrology, was very immediate and personal. Timing can be, I think, lunar timing, one option that you can use around the phases especially is that the moon can be a good starting point for a lot of people in starting to work with astrological timing and starting to work with a relationship between astrology and your own embodiment, and noticing things like, what are your personal energetic cycles, and do they in any way match up to lunar cycles? They might not, and that's okay, but like that's something that you can kind of notice and observe. I personally found that the cycles were already there, but when I started paying attention to where the moon was, I was like, oh, that's really interesting, the way my energy waxes and wanes, like the moon waxes and wanes. And of course we have our, the concept of a month. Now our calendar month is specifically 30 or 31 days. It doesn't quite match up to the lunar month, but some cultures and some societies use the moon to track their months. If you ever wondered or were curious about like why the phases of the moon, like how it works that we have the new moon and it's like always advancing by one sign, and it's not like the new moon is always in Leo, say, right? It's always advancing. That's because of that slight difference between the orbit length and because the orbit is 27 days and the phases are approximately 29 and a half. That being like very slightly off. That's why the date of the new moon is always like a different date in whatever month it is, and it's also why why it advances like that, so that the new moon is actually like experienced in a different sign each month. I was always like curious, like how does that work? And so that's why, if you were wondering about that. And so when you think about your own timing, I'm going to focus on this rather than focusing on your like natal moon phase, because honestly, I haven't worked enough with all the different natal moon phases to really have my own interpretation or like synthesized view on it like I have with other things I've shared here. I tend to just directly reference another YouTuber, Stormy Grace. So you can check out Stormy Grace's channel and just search it for natal moon phases. And Stormy does an excellent job of going through all of the different possibilities for what your moon phase was when you were born. And so you can check that out if you're curious about what the signification is of the moon phase when you were born. So not only do you have a lunar phase in terms of the sign of your moon, and then not a lunar phase, but not only do you have a moon placement in terms of the sign of your moon and the house, you can also look at the relationship between the moon and the sun. And keep in mind that when we say a phase, right, a moon phase isn't just about the moon, it's about the relationship between the sun and the moon. It's about how much light is reflected down to us. And so it has this sense, just like Saturn pulls in from the heavens and then down to Earth, the moon has a similar thing where it pulls from all the other planets and is reflecting, and the sun, especially the light of the sun, is reflecting down, but also has this kind of sense of like, as it goes around the chart, it's passing by every planet so often, right? And so while, say, moon conjunct Saturn is not a big deal because the moon's going to keep conjuncting Saturn every month, it does have this sense of like activating or drawing a little attention to it, just like it draws attention to whatever sign it's in. And so it's giving you this embodied way to work with different things as the moon passes over them. And it can sometimes is known as like the water carrier around the chart for that. One thing that sometimes I think folks like timing by the phase of the moon can be a little, you can get in your head about it. It can be a little like, oh God, it moves so fast, like blink and you miss it. Oh shit, I missed that yesterday was a new moon, and you get in your head about that. But I find that, giving yourself a lot of permission is like a very lunar thing. And also you can choose what you want to honor and kind of add on as you go. So a lot of times we pay attention to new and full moons, and that's one way to get started, is to like just stick those in your calendar and to consider the new and the full moon, and then you can start to add on from there. So like one of the energetically things that I most notice is just the difference between, is the moon waxing or waning? So that's is the light increasing as we go from the new moon around to the full moon, or is it decreasing as we go from the full moon to the new moon? So that has the general signification of kind of a growing or expanding or heightening energy, and then a kind of contracting or shrinking or clearing away and getting ready for the next kind of birth with the new moon. You can add on the idea of the quarters, as it goes around, this first quarter and the last quarter. And then you can do, a lot of folks use the 8 phases. There's various ways of describing the phases of the moon, both ancient and modern. Like there's different ways of thinking about it, but a lot of folks will do the 8 lunar phases. So these they relate to, you can think of it metaphorically, you can think about like the growing cycle. It relates to like the waxing as it's as a seed is like growing and being birthed, and then like it's fruiting, and then it's harvest, and then it decomposes again. Specifically the 8 can be associated with if you're somebody who uses the pagan holidays, uses the solstices, equinox, and the cross-quarter holidays. That can be a little like mental reference for the phases. If you're just trying to remember kind of what they mean, you can think like, oh, okay, this kind of relates to Beltane, this kind of relates to Imbolc. Or you can just think of like time of year. If you imagine the new moon as being, the beginning of the calendar year, and then go around like that, that can be another way to think of it. Or I wouldn't do calendar year, I would do winter solstice, and then think of the full moon as summer solstice. The quarters being the equinoxes, and then you fill in from there. So the way you might work with the energy is going to vary a little bit based on like the tradition and what you're doing. You may, for example, if you're involved in like magical practice, you may have heard, and some kinds of astrology where you like avoid the few days kind of around or to either side of the new moon and the full moon, just because those are more intense energies. And in that case, you're kind of thinking of the new moon as being like just before and just after. Whereas if you're looking in your chart, keep in mind, if you're looking in your chart for what moon phase you were born in, the way that works is that you actually calculate the degrees starting at the thing that is named. So when I say the thing that is named, I mean like the new moon phase starts from the exact conjunction between sun and moon from the point where they're together. And then it goes 45 degrees, and then the waxing crescent starts at that 45 degree mark and then continues until 90 degrees, and then now you're in a first quarter. And so if let's say the relationship between your sun and moon is that your moon is 60 degrees ahead, then the name of that phase is the 45, because it's between 45 and 90 is going to be the waxing crescent. You can also just Google natal moon phases to remind yourself of the numbers. But that helps me to remember it, is that the phase in that astrological sense is we start counting at the thing. We start counting at the new moon, we start counting the crescent, we start counting at the quarter. And those do match up to the aspects we've talked about, but it doesn't have to be exact. So like we would, for example, we would say, let's say you have your sun and your moon opposing each other. We don't know whether that's full moon or not, because full moon would be from the moon being opposite to the next 45 degrees. They're all 45 degrees. So the next 45 degrees. Whereas if your moon was if you're born right before a full moon, your natal moon phase isn't full moon. It's waxing gibbous. It's the phase right before. So I hope that makes sense. That's not to say that like if you're born within, a degree of the full moon, it's not to say that you don't have some of that energy of the full moon, but that's generally the way it's done with the natal phases. So you can think of, again, like check out Stormy Grace for the natal, but if you're just thinking about working with the energy of it and as it goes through the sky, then you can imagine the new moon as being this this kind of seed time, this starting point. You may have heard, by the way, the phrase dark moon. Dark moon is not a phase. That's a observable thing. That's when there's no light. And it varies, I think, from moon to moon, but it's just before the new moon. So it's technically part of the waning crescent, or yeah, we also call it balsamic. The balsamic phase is the same as the waning crescent. But so a lot of times you can like seed or plant your intentions or during the dark moon phase. That's again like a kind of magical practice. And because a lot of folks are like, don't actually seed an intention on the new moon, like just allow. Like new moon is very allow kind of energy. It's a starting point. It's like the seed is in the ground and nothing has grown yet. It's the sense of like the winter solstice where it's like we have the least light, but you know, nothing's really like happening at that time. You know, it's dark, it's quiet, but like it's the potential is there. And so the new moon has a sense of like there's potential there, but we're not really doing anything with it yet. Depending on how you physically, energetically experience the new moon, I know that I tend to find that my energy does wax as the moon waxes and wane as the moon wanes, but the waxing doesn't necessarily start immediately. It starts out kind of slow. So today, as I'm filming this, I'm in a new moon, or moon just happened last night. And so I'm like starting to feel a little bit of energy, but like it's not quite picked up yet, and that's okay. And so as it moves through the waning crescent, you know, we're starting to get a little more like action, a little more movement, a little more energy. As we get to the first quarter, I personally find like that's really we're like, okay, we're picking up speed, we're doing the thing, we're taking action. It's a very action-oriented phase. Again, this may vary for you, especially if you're somebody who was born, I was born actually during a first quarter phase. And I find that for me, my energy goes really with those significations. But I found that for some people who are born during a waning, on the waning side, so if you were born full moon, if you were born waning gibbous, last quarter, or balsamic waning crescent, you may find it switched. Some people find that. Or it may have nothing to do with your chart. You may just find it energetically. But we're just going to talk about, you know, the kind of like standard textbook significations. So we have the first quarter representing, you know, really like action, and we're doing the thing, and that continues, you know, as we're moving through the waxing gibbous. There's this sense of like, okay, we're continuing to act, we're refining, we're getting to that final form. And the full moon, it's got this culmination energy. It's got this energy. It's the greatest light in the sky. When they're opposite, you have the full moon. You can see all the light. So it has this sense of visibility, of sharing, of, you know, being seen, of reaching a final form. And then as we start to wane, now, okay, less and less light, and now we're getting into more of the energy of like discernment and, you know, harvest. So I think it's like the harvest energy is starting as the moon starts to wane. So full thing, and now we're, you know, you can imagine like the fruiting plant. We're starting to harvest the fruits. We're starting to benefit from our labors. We're starting to, you know, experience results. We're also, and especially as we get closer and closer to the end of the cycle, it's obviously a circle, but as we get closer and closer, then there's more of this sense of like, so again, discernment, like what are we pushing away? What are we clearing away? You know, harvest can also be a time of review. And as we get towards like the last quarter, there can be this sense of like, okay, what am I reviewing? What do we keep? What do we not keep? What is serving? What is not serving? You know, what am I going to sustain? And I want to actually carry through the next cycle and continue to be part of me and something that I hold. Or what do I want to delegate, pass on? Or what do I want to just completely let go and allow to compost? You know, there's this, especially as we get towards the end of the waning cycle, this opportunity to compost and release what hasn't served, into that soil where the seed is going to be planted for the next time. There's also, closer and closer we get to the end of that cycle and towards the next new moon, into the dark moon, there's this sense of rest, of recovery, of the need to go slower. You know, I tend to like find that, you know, my energy remains like decently high, like a few days after the full moon, and then it starts to really wane, and it starts to be like, okay, we need to rest. So the moon gives us this beautiful reminder that we don't always have to be bright and vibrant and present, and seen, that as the light reduces, it's also the sense of like, maybe I want to go internal, maybe I want to be more introverted, maybe I want to rest. I need to allow incubation, I need to allow integration of what's happened, of the lessons of this month, in order to have fertile soil where we can plant something new, right? We can't always be our biggest and brightest selves. And so I think the moon is really a beautiful, you know, this is really like getting into the practical side of Practical Astrology 101, right? The moon is a really beautiful ally for resisting this like capitalist, cultural kind of societal urges that are like being on all the time, being consistent, like always having consistent energy. It's like, no. Moon's associated with our bodies, and our bodies need this like expansion, contraction. They need to be able to show different forms of ourselves. You can also, you know, I think in my culture at least, I think there's this tendency to expect even that the face that we show is always the same, right? So like our bodies, you know, not changing. The idea that you would just stay at the same size and shape your whole life, or that, you know, trying to fight wrinkles, things like that. The moon is like, no, the moon shows themselves in different ways throughout the cycle, different amounts of light. And I love that the kind of dark period just before the new moon is, I think of it as like the moon has this job of reflecting light back to us, and the moon gets a break. The moon gets a little brief rest where there's no light to reflect, and the moon is just whatever the moon is by herself when nobody's looking. So a good like prompt for that time can be, you know, who are you in the dark? Who are you when you're on your own? Who are you when nobody's looking at you? That's that beautiful medicine of that waning, the end of the waning cycle of, it's not only about active, you know, the active beginning of the waning cycle, you know, that active review, that active reflection, that active harvesting and figuring out, but it's also like full dark, the winter time, the going internal, and the chance to just be who you are, without reflecting, without being projections and mirrors and interaction with other people. So you can remind yourself, okay, what is my center? What is my core place? And then you're going to show up from that in the next cycle. So that's the basic idea. And I think what is really helpful there as well is the fact that you have cycles within cycles. And so, for example, I'm speaking to you from the new moon in Virgo. I can look at the month, and I tend to look at the month cycle more like energetically, like I just spoke about. So I can look at what am I seeding, like, you know, I during the dark moon kind of seeded some intentions for this month, and how I'm going to use my energy as it waxes and wanes to kind of do what I would like to do for the month. But that also falls within a bigger cycle of new moon in Virgo all the way around the year to the previous new moon in Virgo. So you can often look at for new and full moons, especially, is often like a time to reflect on this, to do this. You can say, like, when you get to a full moon, what happened 6 months ago? What you can look at, like, what did I seed? What was starting? Because even if you intentionally seeded it, you intentionally started it, a lot of times, you know, who knows how that turns out. So at the new moon, you can be both seeding for the month, but also seeding intentions for, like, what do you want to be building over the next year? And you can look, if you'd like, to the house where that sign falls in your chart. So like for me, Virgo falls in my third house. And I might say, like, oh, what are some intentions that I have in the third house topics and themes around? That's actually really funny because I hadn't thought about it until just now. And I go, oh no, that's definitely happening for me right now. Like I am actually thinking about like how I process information, how I communicate in kind of like a small scale way. I'm thinking about my local environment. You know, you can think about your, you know, neighbors, siblings, or, right, like some of these third house significations. I can think about what do I want to see in that area of my life, and then I can look when the full moon comes and say, oh, over the past 6 months, you know, what's there? And then I could even, if I wanted to right now, say, ooh, let's review and reflect. I might do that more around the quarter point, right? But what has, you know, how have I worked with, or what has changed around what the previous full moon in Virgo, what was like shown in light and clear, like how have I discerned, and what have I changed and reviewed and reflected on to get to this point at the new moon. So you can, if you want to, look at, because the moon goes through every single phase and every single sign through the course of a year. So you could say, like, when the first quarter moon in Virgo happens approximately 3 months from now, maybe I do a quick just like level check and be like, cool, what action am I taking? Because it's a really action oriented time. You know, what action am I taking towards my goals for the next 6 months? So that's a way you can even do like goal setting and intention setting around the moons. And that's a common way to kind of check in. And you can think of like each month, each lunar phase, each lunar phase cycle, each synodic cycle, as giving you an opportunity to, like, you know, keep working with these things. So that is something you may want to consider. So finally, I want to briefly touch on, I've actually already done, I believe, there are at least one, maybe 2 videos about the nodes and eclipses. So I'm just going to cover them quickly, and I'll put a link there, you know, reference you to those already created videos. But the nodes of the moon, you may have heard of the concept of the north node, the south node. These are calculated points that, and I don't want to mess this up because I kind of messed this up in the earlier video, but they're calculated points that have to do with the ecliptic, I'm so bad at describing the ecliptic, but you know what, go back to the transit video, I'm not going to try, but they're calculated points, and so you can look in your chart for your natal north node and south node, and that would indicate where, around the time you were born, where the eclipses were happening. So like right now, if you look for where is the north node, you'll notice that it's in Taurus. That happens to be my natal north node as well. It's in Taurus, and so we've been having eclipses in Taurus and Scorpio, because the south node's in Scorpio. As they move, as they transit, we move into different signs where we're having the eclipses. So beyond the eclipses themselves, we can actually look at the nodes as their own thing, and I can look in a chart and say, okay, the natal north node and the natal south node. So the natal south node, and this is where the tradition really varies, because you know, we're not covering Vedic astrology, but like Vedic astrology has a lot on this. There are specific significations that look evolutionary, which is a modern astrology technique. You know, some of the more psychological traditions of modern astrology look at the nodes a certain way. The Greeks look at the nodes a different way. So there's all different ways. So this is not like the one way to look at the nodes, but a way to look at the nodes in your chart is to consider the south node as a point that kind of represents an energy that might be more a default, something you're accustomed to. You know, the sign in the house where that shows up can point to a kind of area of tendency, an area of default, especially earlier in life. And if you're someone who does believe in past lives and works with past lives, you can also look at that as sort of the lessons that you already learned in some number of past lives that you came here with already. And so that's kind of how you showed up. Or you can just think of it as early in life, how you started out, your defaults. And then as you get older and as you move through the course of your life, that nodal axis represents a kind of challenge, a kind of soul growth journey, invitation to you to bring in more of the north node. Now, it's not leave the south behind. They're not saying like go all the way over here. I think of the nodes as being really about integration and about integrating that polarity. And so it's actually that polarity between 2 signs. So for me, it's Taurus, Scorpio, that I'm really invited to like work with what is the Taurus Scorpio polarity. And maybe I started out this life more, you know, defaulting and like always falling back into Scorpio. Very true, I know myself. But how can I bring in Taurus, and how can I work with Taurus, and how can I blend the two? How can I meld the two? How can I look for opportunities? Because Taurus is going to be less natural energy for me. My soul growth over life is to be able to like bring some of these Taurian themes in. And when the nodes come back to the points where they were at your birth, which is approximately every 12 years, so right now I'm having my own nodal return, is where its north node is where your north node was, south node is where your south node was. That can be a point of a sort of a little bit of like an activation, an up level, an invitation. So like I've been noticing like a lot of themes around, all right, how are you integrating this north node? How are you integrating, for me that's in the 11th house, how are you integrating particularly like Taurus themes and Taurus themes around the 11th, and how are you working with the 11th, have all really come up for me this year as it's gotten closer. It's actually this summer when it went exact for me. And there's so much more you can do with the nodes, you know, looking at planets that square the nodes, looking at planets conjunct the nodes, all sorts of stuff we don't really have time for. But, you know, I've done a video on it, but I might do more on that. Now the transiting nodes, in addition, are something you can look at. So wherever the north node is transiting, it can bring this sense of increase to whatever it's activating, whatever it's going over. And then the south node can bring this sense of decrease or less of whatever it's going over. So we had this recently where the north node, Mars and Uranus were all conjunct. And so it's like the Mars-Uranus conjunction with that north node, the north node is increasing. It's like amplifying the already present Mars-Uranus. So it's like if you had Mars-Uranus, it's a bigger Mars-Uranus. That also happens. So if you notice the north node passing over something in your chart, it can increase the prominence of that point. It can activate it. It can activate any other aspects natally to that point, and bring an emphasis to it. And then the south node can kind of like pull away or decrease, or even like release from that point. And finally, eclipses. So you know, the nodes, in addition, I mentioned that that's where the eclipses are happening. So an eclipse is going to happen if it's a solar, I had to like think for a second. Solar eclipse is new moon. So a new moon, a solar eclipse, you may have, you know, actually witnessed a solar eclipse, whether it was a full and you could actually look at it, or a total eclipse, or a partial where you still needed to use something special so you didn't hurt your eyes. But it's that familiar eclipse idea, right, of the moon obscuring, going right over. So the new moon, you know, it's always a conjunction, but because they're a little off, if you imagine them passing like this, if one's like a little below the other, they don't usually actually, like the moon doesn't actually obscure the sun, but the ecliptic is this like north-south, where if they hit right on that node, right at the same point north-south wise, then it's actually going to cover it. And so a solar eclipse is just like a bigger new moon, like even more of a new moon energy. And the same thing is true with a lunar eclipse, where you have them opposite and north-south exact. That's going to be an even bigger sense of of the significations of a full moon. And so you can consider, like, at those times, even more so the thing about, like, maybe don't try to, like, plan intentions or do important things, like, right at the new and full moon. That's way amplified with eclipses. So I tend to, like, I never try to, like, intentionally do something on those days, or like expect something on those days. I really work with the eclipses as they're going to do something in your life, and you're just present to that. You're along for the ride and you're allowing that to happen. And then after the eclipse, as it unfolds, you can work with it, or you can as it approaches, right, you can, so same as with a new moon, like a solar eclipse is coming, you can look at what sign that's happening in, what house that's happening in your own chart. And you can say, okay, I want to like do some discernment and some clearing to make space for the eclipse to act upon me, to bring something in my life. And, just like you would towards the end of a waning cycle. And similarly, if it's a lunar eclipse, that full moon, right, you know that's coming. Like maybe before that could be a time to be taking action in that area and, doing what you can to allow that to really like manifest on that date. But you wouldn't, I wouldn't typically like have the launch, have the, thing be on an eclipse. I think that it's a little like, it's got this very like mysterious kind of magical, but also kind of trickster energy, I think, the eclipses sometimes. Where something's going to happen, but you often can't predict it. It's very hard to be like, it's an eclipse, it's in this house, so this is going to happen. The moon will always be like, nice try. So it'll always give you something related to that, but not what you expected. That said, dramatic transformation can come out of eclipses, and so they can be really, really amazing. And I've very much seen this happen. Like really amazing things can come out of them. And so just allowing that to happen. With the moon in general, I think, the moon also, I didn't even say this word, which is kind of funny, but I mentioned reflect and the idea of mirror and the idea of passing on, but it's also this receiving, right? It's transmitting, but it's also a receiving. There's a lot of receiving with the moon. And so we don't really honor receiving as much as we could in our culture. So I think that the moon, in addition to inviting us to be liminal, to be fluid, to be shifting, to allow ourselves to not be consistent, it also invites us to receive and to allow and to surrender and to let, astrology doesn't always have to be like, okay, what time is the thing happening and let me time everything by it. In fact, I found as a very lunar person myself, so I'm doing this moon video as a Cancer moon conjunct rising, like the lunariest lunar of the lunars. And I can tell you that like I have very much found that the more I track and try to make things in my mind and try to brain astrology, the more sort of anxiety provoking it is and stuff doesn't happen the way I expected. But the more I allow and embody, and I think in working with the moon, really energetically embody and just see what happens and am curious and open to what I feel, and I listen to my body, right? This is receiving. I'm listening to like my intuition, my body wisdom. My body. Oh look, it's my calendar talking to me. My body wisdom, and I allow myself to receive that somatically. I can see my body as communicating with me, as having a language of its own and being a beacon and telling me, what I need. Moon is also associated with our core, most basic needs. As well as our day-to-day needs. And so you can look for, am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Hey, if you're watching this, take a drink of your water. Our body can be such an oracle, such a communicator with us, and the moon invites us to go quiet, to listen, to observe, and not always to be speaking and projecting and giving and like outward, but also to allow ourselves to take in. Not always to be giving in the sense of like people pleasing and helping others, but also to allow, to receive, to ask for help, or just to surrender to state an intention and allow things to come to us. I think that is really beautiful and powerful moon wisdom. And so if you're having anxiety about like, oh, I missed the full moon, like don't worry about it. It'll happen. The moon's still going to be full, right? It'll still act upon you. And so you can just like relax into that. So again, if you're seeing this around when I put it out or within the next couple of weeks, we do have the link below. We'd love to join you, Lex, Richie, and I, for the non-binary moon workshop. And we will be actually directly talking about this, about lunar practice. We will be sharing, ideas for you, how to have an embodied lunar practice, particularly how to have a non-binary practice, whether you are non-binary as an identity yourself, or you just want to expand the gender significations. You want to look at different ways you can think about nurturing and care and all those things with the moon, and how to like have some like trust and permissioning around your practice is all going to be included in that workshop as well. So check out that link. Really would love for you to join. Again, there's a sliding scale, so we hope to make it accessible for everyone, and we would love to see you there joining us. And that's going to be on a full moon, so it'll be a little bit of an opportunity to celebrate the full moon. And if you would like, there's also, if you missed it on this channel, I'll put a link here I did a conversation with Lex, a Cancer moon to a Capricorn moon, and we talked a little bit about our own practices and some of that, like allowing and how practices can look differently. You know, if you're somebody who doesn't really relate to the moon, like what are some ways that you might work with it as well. Okay, thank you so much for joining me. Our next video will be our final wrap up for the little fundamental mini series, and we'll consider that a wrap. And so I look forward to doing that. We'll see you for that next time. And then we'll continue on. Practical Astrology 101 will still be a thing. We just wanted to get those fundamentals out of the way. And we'll probably be talking more in the future about more like little specific topics, as well as, you know, what's going on in the sky at the moment and maybe how you can integrate and work with it. So if you have requests, if you have things you would like, you can leave them below. And of course, you know, I am like joyfully happy to provide all this information for free, and to teach and to provide this is my absolute joy. If you did receive value from it and you're able to, you can also find the Patreon link below to support. My supporter model for this channel is very much optional. You know, however much you'd like to contribute, there's all different tiers, $1 on up. And so I would love for those who are able to help to kind of subsidize keeping this afloat and sustainable for those who are not, so that we can get as many people access to this content as possible. So I'd love it if you check that out. You can also share with a friend, and I would love for you to sign up for my newsletter. That is where I can't always happen to have a video where I can announce stuff like this workshop. And so if you want to know when I'm doing stuff, if you want exclusive access to, you know, first pass at things, to discounts, to all that good stuff, as well as to a newsletter where I do some writing and I round up all the things like this that I'm doing around the internet, check out that link below. queermagical.com is the link. You can just type that and you can sign up for the newsletter. I'm really trying to bring folks into that container so that I have a way to reach you and let you know about the exciting stuff that is happening. All right, thanks so much, and enjoy your time working with the moon. I certainly have.